Margaret Ellis was 63 years old when the pattern of her quiet life began to fracture. She lived in a narrow brick townhouse in the Riverside district of Chicago, a neighborhood that had once been full of new paint and young families, but now wore its age openly. The sidewalks were cracked. The streetlights flickered when the wind shifted off Lake Michigan. In winter, the cold settled into the bones of the buildings and refused to leave. 6 months earlier, Margaret had stood beside a hospital bed at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, holding the hand of her husband, Thomas, as machines quietly marked the end of a life they had built over 41 years. Thomas had been a middle school science teacher, patient, methodical, endlessly curious. Margaret had worked most of her life as a compliance clerk for a mid-sized insurance processing firm downtown. Their savings were modest. The life insurance was practical, not generous. By the time the medical bills and funeral expenses were settled, what remained barely covered property taxes and utilities for the year. Retirement had been a distant conversation they sometimes entertained over dinner. After Thomas died, it disappeared entirely. Their daughter lived in Oregon now, busy with her own children and a career that rarely slowed. They spoke on Sundays. The calls were warm but careful, like both women were avoiding stepping on something fragile. Grief did that. It created a distance that politeness could not cross. Margaret returned to work sooner than anyone expected. The firm had recently absorbed several smaller claims departments and now handled long-term disability settlements, injury payouts, and structured annuities for clients across the Midwest. The workload had doubled. Oversight had not. She transferred to the late shift voluntarily. Fewer people. Fewer questions. Fewer sympathetic looks. Her new hours ran from 3 p.m. until midnight. At that hour, downtown Chicago emptied into wind tunnels between buildings. The elevated trains rattled overhead like restless thoughts. The last commuter buses stopped running before her shift ended, and walking to the nearest station alone after midnight felt increasingly reckless. Her daughter insisted she download a rideshare app. Margaret resisted at first. She disliked depending on strangers. Eventually practicality won. That was how she met Daniel Rivera. The first time his dark gray hybrid sedan pulled up outside the insurance building, Margaret hesitated under the overhang near the security desk. Snow swirled in tight circles along the curb. Daniel looked to be in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with streaks of gray at his temples and the posture of someone accustomed to physical work. His rating was flawless, 5 stars across hundreds of rides. She slid into the back seat. "Long shift?" he asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "They all are," she replied. He nodded once, not pressing for more. Over the next several weeks, something unusual happened. Daniel accepted nearly every one of her late-night requests. Same pickup time. Same calm voice. Same steady driving. He did not overshare. He did not pry. He drove as if the responsibility of getting someone home safely was not just a job, but an agreement. Margaret began to notice small things. He adjusted the temperature before she asked. He avoided potholes on her street without slowing abruptly. He waited until her porch light flickered on before pulling away. In December, when Chicago's cold turned metallic and sharp, Margaret started bringing a thermos of chamomile tea for herself. One night, almost without thinking, she poured a second cup into a travel mug and handed it forward. "You don't have to," Daniel said quietly. "I know," she answered, "but it's cold." He accepted it with a nod that carried more weight than the gesture itself. 12-minute rides turned into the only human conversations Margaret had face-to-face all week. She learned that Daniel had once worked as a building maintenance supervisor for commercial high-rises. 3 years earlier, a suspended platform malfunction had sent him falling 2 stories. He survived, but his knee and shoulder never healed correctly. He could no longer climb ladders or lift heavy equipment. Driving nights kept him mobile and paid for his mother's assisted living facility. He spoke of it without resentment. Margaret, in turn, mentioned work. At first, it was harmless frustration, duplicate claim numbers, mismatched signatures, payment delays. Then it became something else. The firm had initiated a quiet internal audit after several long-term disability settlements were flagged for adjustment discrepancies. The differences were small, fractions of percentages shaved from payouts, rerouted installment dates, modified beneficiaries on secondary documentation. Individually, they looked like clerical errors. Collectively, they formed a pattern. Margaret's supervisor assigned her to verify original contracts against scanned records stored in the digital archive. It was tedious work. Most nights passed in silence, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights. Daniel listened when she described it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss her concerns as office paranoia. One Thursday night, as they turned onto her block, Daniel slowed unexpectedly. "There's been a blue SUV parked across from your house 3 nights this week," he said casually. Margaret laughed softly. "It's Chicago. Cars live longer on the street than people do." He didn't argue, but his eyes stayed on the vehicle until they passed. 2 days later, Margaret noticed her side gate slightly ajar. She was certain she had latched it. The latch was old, yes, but she remembered the sound it made when it clicked. She told herself the wind had shifted it. The following week, a yellow envelope containing her handwritten audit notes disappeared from her kitchen counter. She searched every drawer, every folder in her briefcase. Nothing. She convinced herself she had thrown it away accidentally. When she mentioned it in passing during a ride, Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Did you take any original document home?" he asked. "Never," she said immediately. "Everything stays logged." "That's the point." He nodded slowly, but she could see calculation in his reflection. Over the next month, Daniel began noticing more. The same blue SUV idling once at the end of the block. A man standing near the corner deli after midnight more than twice in a week. A sedan pulling away slowly when his headlights turned onto Margaret Street. Margaret dismissed each observation with logic. Cities were full of repetition. Familiar strangers existed everywhere. But Daniel had spent years reading buildings, identifying stress fractures invisible to tenants, detecting wiring faults behind walls before they sparked. Patterns mattered to him. One rainy Tuesday in January, Margaret worked later than usual. The audit had intensified. She had found 3 separate files in which beneficiary information had been modified months after settlements were supposedly finalized. The digital timestamps showed authorized changes. The physical originals did not. Someone had access. Someone was altering history quietly. When she stepped outside at 12:08 a.m., the air felt wrong. Not colder, not louder, just off. Daniel's car was waiting. She climbed in and handed him tea automatically. He pulled away from the curb and missed the first right turn toward Riverside. Margaret frowned gently. "You passed Ashland." Daniel did not respond immediately. His jaw was set. His eyes scanned mirrors more frequently than usual. He drove straight through the intersection. "Daniel," she asked, her voice thinner now. "I need you to stay calm," he said quietly. "And I need you to listen." Her pulse stumbled. Instead of turning toward her block, he merged onto a wider avenue that led away from her neighborhood entirely. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere public."
Somewhere Lee.
Rain began tapping against the windshield in a thin, steady rhythm. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Before I picked you up tonight," he said, "I drove past your street." The words hung between them. "Why?" she whispered. "Because the blue SUV was there again," he answered. "And this time, the engine was warm." Margaret's breath caught. "I watched a man get out," Daniel continued. "He walked to your gate. He tried it. Then he walked to your front door. The city lights blurred as tears filled her eyes. "He tried your handle," Daniel said. And when it didn't open, he stood there, looking through the window. Silence swallowed the car. "If you had gone home 10 minutes ago," Daniel added carefully, "you would have walked straight into him waiting in the dark." Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth to steady her breathing. "Who?" she managed. Daniel's voice lowered. "Do you know someone named Richard Hallberg?" The name hit her like ice water. She had seen it twice that week, signed on digital authorization forms for modified settlements. Richard Hallberg, senior risk consultant. Margaret's world shifted quietly, permanently. Daniel kept driving, and the night that was supposed to end in routine began unraveling into something neither of them could ignore. Daniel did not drive directly to the police station. Instead, he circled 3 blocks north, turned twice without signaling, and pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of a 24-hour pharmacy near the river. Snowmelt reflected the fluorescent lights in fractured streaks across the asphalt. The store windows were bright enough to make anyone standing nearby visible from a distance. He parked facing the entrance. Margaret's hands were shaking. "Tell me everything you know about Richard Hallberg," Daniel said quietly. Margaret swallowed. Her throat felt tight, as if the air itself had thickened. "He's senior risk oversight," she began slowly. "Not management exactly. More like compliance approval. When large disability settlements are finalized, someone in his role signs off on structured payout schedules. He authorizes adjustments." Daniel nodded. "And his name appears on the files you've been auditing?" "Yes." She stared straight ahead. "At first it was routine. Then I noticed something strange. The digital signatures on 3 modified settlements matched his authorization code, but the physical originals in storage did not reflect those changes." Meaning? "Meaning someone altered the digital record after the finalization date, and whoever did it used credentials that belonged to him." Daniel leaned back in his seat, thinking. Could someone else have access to his login? In theory? No. In practice? She hesitated. The firm's IT protocols aren't exactly airtight, but high-level credentials are monitored. And he would know that. Margaret nodded slowly. Rain streaked down the windshield in narrow lines. She felt like she was watching her normal life dissolve. "I never told anyone about the specific names," she whispered. "Not even my supervisor. I was still verifying." Daniel looked at her in the mirror. "Did you take notes home?" No, her answer was immediate. "I made a temporary summary on a yellow legal pad one night. File numbers. Cross-references. I kept it on my kitchen counter." "The one that disappeared?" "Yes." Daniel inhaled deeply. "I need you to understand something," he said. "The man I saw tonight wasn't checking your door randomly. He knew which house to approach. He knew your schedule. That means one of 2 things. Either someone followed you from work repeatedly, or someone inside your workplace knows exactly who you are and where you live." Margaret's stomach tightened. "He knows where I live," she said faintly. Daniel nodded once. "Yes." They sat in silence for several seconds. Then Margaret said the words that made everything sharper. "He approved every altered payout I flagged." Daniel's expression hardened. "And if you prove fraud," he said, "he becomes criminally liable." Margaret felt cold despite the heater running. "What if he thinks I already have proof?" she asked. Daniel didn't soften the answer. "Then tonight wasn't intimidation," he said quietly. "It was retrieval." The word landed heavily. Retrieval. As if she were an obstacle. As if her house were storage. Margaret suddenly remembered something else. "Last week," she said slowly, "the basement archive vault had a scheduled maintenance window. Hallberg was listed as on-site oversight. I didn't think anything of it. And you work nights?" "Yes." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Meaning he knows exactly when you leave. Exactly when the building empties." Exactly how long it takes you to get home. Margaret felt the terrifying clarity of it all aligning. Routine had become surveillance. Familiarity had become access. Daniel picked up his phone. "I'm going to call this in," he said. "Wait." Margaret grabbed the edge of her seat. "If he has credentials, if he's seen your oversight, won't that complicate things?" "It might," Daniel replied. "But if we don't document what happened tonight, it becomes your word against his later." He dialed. The responding officers arrived within 15 minutes. Margaret repeated everything: the audit discrepancies, the missing legal pad, the SUV, the attempted entry. Daniel described what he had seen in precise detail: time, position, clothing, vehicle make, and plate number. He had memorized it without effort. One officer ran the plate. The result made Margaret's chest tighten. The SUV was registered to a corporate fleet under her insurance firm's holding company. Not personal. Corporate. Richard Hallberg had access to company vehicles. The officers exchanged looks. "You said he works in risk oversight?" one asked. "Yes." "And he has authorized access to the building after hours?" "Yes." They asked Margaret to accompany them back toward Riverside while a second patrol unit canvassed the block. Daniel followed behind in his car. When they turned onto her street, blue and red lights reflected off wet pavement. The blue SUV was gone, but her front gate hung open. Officers approached first, weapons low but ready. Margaret stayed inside the patrol car. The front door showed no visible damage. The lock remained intact. But when an officer stepped to the side window and angled his flashlight inward, he paused. "What?" Margaret whispered. The officer motioned another closer. "There's movement inside," he said quietly. Margaret's heart stopped. A shadow shifted across her living room wall. The officers moved quickly. One circled the back alley. The other knocked sharply. "Chicago police." Silence. Then sudden motion. The back officer shouted. Moments later, a man was forced face down in the wet grass behind Margaret's townhouse, wrists secured in cuffs. Even from a distance, Margaret recognized him. Richard Hallberg. He did not look drunk. He did not look confused. He looked furious. When he lifted his head and saw Margaret standing beside the patrol car, something colder than anger flashed across his face. Recognition. "You have no idea what you've interfered with," he said through clenched teeth. Margaret felt Daniel's step quietly beside her. "Yes," Daniel replied evenly. "She does." Officers entered the house to clear it fully. Inside, they found her kitchen drawers open, her filing cabinet pulled halfway from the wall, the living room cushions displaced, her bedroom closet disturbed. He had been searching, not waiting. Searching. Margaret's knees weakened. "If you had come home," Daniel murmured quietly, "he would have still been inside." The officers read Hallberg his rights. One of them retrieved a small black USB device from his coat pocket. Another found a folded sheet of paper listing settlement case numbers, the same numbers Margaret had flagged. It was no longer a misunderstanding. It was active obstruction. Hallberg was transported immediately. Margaret was escorted inside only after the scene was secured. The violation felt heavier than broken glass would have. Nothing smashed. Nothing overturned dramatically. Just quiet disruption. Intentional. Calculated. A detective arrived within the hour. "Ms. Ellis," he said carefully, "based on what we've seen tonight and the corporate plate registration, we're elevating this beyond trespassing." Margaret nodded weakly. "We'll need full cooperation from your employer. Internal audit records. Access logs. Authorization credentials." Daniel remained present, silent but steady. The detective looked at him. "You followed your instincts," he said. "That likely prevented escalation." Daniel didn't answer. He simply looked at Margaret's open doorway and then at the empty street beyond it. The normal shape of her life had split open. and now it could not be closed quietly. Margaret did not sleep that night. After detectives finished photographing the interior of her townhouse and collecting evidence, she was advised not to remain there alone. An officer drove her to a small business hotel near the Loop, the kind with beige hallways and quiet elevators that hummed without personality. Daniel followed behind until he saw her enter safely. When she closed the hotel room door, the silence felt different than the silence in her own house. This one was temporary, neutral. It carried no memory of Thomas, no echo of shared routines. It also carried no sense of safety. Safety, she realized, was no longer tied to walls. It was tied to awareness. At 7:30 the next morning, her phone rang. It was her supervisor, Elaine Foster. "I just got a call from corporate legal," Elaine said without preamble. "Police were in your house last night?" Margaret inhaled slowly. "Yes." There was a pause. "And Richard Hallberg was arrested?" "Yes." Elaine's voice shifted, from shock to something closer to fear. "Margaret, what exactly did you find in those audit files?" "Enough," Margaret replied quietly. "Enough that someone didn't want me finishing." By noon, the insurance firm's downtown building was crawling with investigators. Local detectives were joined by federal agents once the financial implications became clear. The altered settlements Margaret had flagged were not isolated mistakes. They were fragments of a coordinated siphoning operation. The scheme was subtle. Long-term disability and structured injury settlements are rarely paid in single lump sums. They are dispersed in installments, monthly, quarterly, annually, often over decades. Beneficiaries tend to be vulnerable, elderly claimants, injured laborers, individuals without the resources to track fine print changes. Hallberg, in his role as senior risk oversight, had access to adjustment authority. He could approve revised payout schedules if administrative corrections were required. Margaret's audit revealed a pattern. Small percentage reductions, 1 or 2%, applied months after initial authorization. Secondary beneficiary modifications routing fractions of payouts into shell accounts disguised as custodial trust managers. Digital timestamps overwritten during scheduled system maintenance windows. Physical originals removed from basement storage and replaced with modified copies matching the fraudulent digital records. Individually, each adjustment was nearly invisible. Collectively, over 3 years, they totaled more than $1.8 million. When investigators secured Hallberg's office computer, they found encrypted folders tied to offshore holding accounts. When they executed a warrant on his home, they discovered printed surveillance photographs of Margaret's townhouse, front gate, side window, rear entry. One envelope was labeled simply, "Contingency." Inside was a handwritten list of audit case numbers, the same ones Margaret had flagged, followed by her name and address. The realization was not dramatic. It was worse. It was methodical. He had not panicked. He had planned. Margaret was asked to provide a formal statement at the federal building in downtown Chicago. Daniel offered to drive her. She did not hesitate. They rode mostly in silence. Outside, the city moved as it always had, buses exhaling at corners, pedestrians rushing with coffee cups, construction cranes frozen against gray sky. It was unsettling how unchanged everything appeared. Inside the federal office, Margaret walked investigators step by step through her discovery process. She described the initial discrepancies, the mismatched signatures, the altered beneficiaries, the missing yellow legal pad. "Did you ever confront Mr. Hallberg directly?" one agent asked. "No," she said. "I was still verifying. I hadn't escalated beyond my supervisor." "Did he know you were auditing his approvals?" Margaret hesitated. "He would have known someone was assigned. But I never spoke to him personally about it." Daniel's recorded observations were also entered into evidence. His documentation of repeated surveillance on her street established intent. His eyewitness account of Hallberg attempting entry into her home strengthened the obstruction charge. Without that attempt, the case might have remained financial fraud alone. With it, it became conspiracy, stalking, and attempted unlawful entry with intent to intimidate a witness. Over the following week, the story broke publicly. Local Chicago outlets ran headlines about an insurance executive arrested in a multi-million-dollar disability fraud scheme. Margaret's name was not initially released, but within professional circles, her role became known. Colleagues who had once barely spoken to her began sending messages. "Are you okay? I had no idea. You were brave."
Brave.
The word felt misplaced. She had not intended to expose anyone. She had intended to correct paperwork. Meanwhile, Daniel was interviewed twice more by investigators. His consistency never wavered. Dates matched logs. Plate numbers matched security cameras. His description of the attempted entry aligned perfectly with body camera footage from the arrest. At one point, an agent asked him directly, "What made you decide not to drop her off that night?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "Pattern deviation," he said. "Same vehicle too often. Same idling time. Engine warm in freezing weather. And the way he stood at the window, not confused. Not hesitant. Evaluating." The agent nodded. "You trusted your instincts." Daniel's response was simple. "I've ignored them before. It cost me." Margaret didn't ask what he meant. Not yet. 2 weeks later, the formal charges were filed in federal court.
Fraud. White fraud.
Identity manipulation. Obstruction of justice. Witness intimidation. Attempted unlawful entry. Hallberg pleaded not guilty. Bail was denied. Margaret was placed under temporary protective monitoring until the initial hearings concluded. Officers performed routine drive-bys at her townhouse once she returned home. The locks were reinforced. Motion-activated floodlights installed along the side of the house. The physical security measures were comforting, but the psychological shift was deeper. Margaret began replaying the months before the arrest. The blue SUV parked across the street. The man under the deli awning twice in 1 week. The missing notes. The open gate. Each moment had been a quiet signal. Individually dismissible. Together undeniable. At work, the insurance firm underwent sweeping internal restructuring. External auditors were hired. Credential systems were overhauled. Dual verification processes were implemented for settlement modifications. Basement archive access was restricted to biometric clearance. Elaine Foster privately thanked Margaret more than once. "You stopped something that could have destroyed this company," she said. Margaret shook her head gently. "I just followed the numbers." But she knew it wasn't only numbers. It was attention. Attention to patterns. Attention to small inconsistencies. Attention to instinct. Daniel continued driving nights. Margaret continued working late shifts, though she now sat in the front seat instead of the back. It felt less like being transported and more like participating. One evening, as they drove past the river, Margaret finally asked the question she had been holding. "You said you ignored your instincts once before," she said softly. "What happened?" Daniel's grip tightened briefly on the steering wheel. "My son," he replied. "Years ago. He was spending time with people I didn't trust. I saw signs. I dismissed them. Told myself I was overreacting. He got involved in something small that became something bigger. No one died, but it fractured us. He blamed me for not stepping in. I blamed myself for staying quiet." Margaret listened carefully. "I promised myself after that," Daniel continued, "if something felt wrong, I wouldn't ignore it again." They drove in silence for a while. Finally, Margaret said, "You didn't just save me. You redeemed something in yourself." Daniel didn't answer. But he didn't deny it. The court date was set for early autumn. Margaret would have to testify. And for the first time since the arrest, she felt fear return. Not of physical danger, but of confrontation. Of seeing Hallberg again. Of hearing him speak. Yet beneath the fear was something steadier. She knew now how easily routine could conceal threat. And she knew how quickly awareness could dismantle it. The story was no longer just about fraud. It was about the moment someone chooses to pay attention and refuses to look away. By the time the trial began in early autumn, Chicago had shifted seasons again. The air was cooler, cleaner, touched by that first quiet promise of winter. Margaret noticed how ordinary everything looked the morning she walked up the granite steps of the federal courthouse downtown. Commuters hurried past with headphones in. A delivery truck blocked half the street. Somewhere nearby, a siren wailed and then faded. Life had not paused for what almost happened. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt heavier than the hallway outside. Richard Hallberg sat at the defense table in a dark suit, thinner than Margaret remembered from the night of his arrest. He did not look at her when she entered. He studied a stack of papers instead, jaw tight, posture controlled. Margaret had imagined this moment dozens of times. She expected anger. She expected fear. What she felt instead was clarity. She was not here because she had been brave. She was here because she had been observant, and because someone else had been paying attention when it mattered most. The prosecution laid out the financial evidence first. Expert witnesses described the mechanics of structured settlements, how small percentage deviations, when applied repeatedly across hundreds of files, could siphon vast amounts of money without immediate detection. Charts were projected on screens. Account numbers traced. Digital timestamps analyzed. The pattern Margaret had seen late at night under fluorescent lights now appeared on a massive screen in front of 12 jurors. It no longer looked like clerical error. It looked like design. When Margaret was called to testify, she walked steadily to the stand. Her hands trembled only slightly as she took the oath. She spoke clearly. She described her role at the insurance firm, the initial discrepancies, the missing original documents, the altered beneficiaries. She explained how she verified file integrity and why the digital modifications could not have been accidental. The prosecutor asked, "At what point did you believe the changes were intentional?" When the digital timestamps corresponded to maintenance windows authorized by Mr. Hallberg, she replied. And when the physical originals no longer matched the archive scans. And did you ever accuse him directly?
No.
I was still gathering confirmation. The courtroom remained silent. Then came the part that shifted everything. "Miss Ellis," the prosecutor said gently, "please describe the evening of January 14th. Margaret inhaled slowly. She described leaving work late. The rain. The misturn. Daniel's voice telling her to stay calm. The pharmacy parking lot. The words, 'He tried your door.'" She did not look at Hallberg as she spoke, but she felt his presence. "When you returned home with police," the prosecutor continued, "what did you discover?" "That he was already inside," she said. A ripple moved through the courtroom. The defense attempted to reframe the entry as confusion, a misunderstanding of address, a well-intentioned concern about company data. But body camera footage told a different story. So, did the USB drive found in his pocket? So, did the contingency list with her name written beside specific case numbers? When Daniel took the stand the following morning, the tone shifted again. He did not dramatize. He did not embellish. He described patterns. "The SUV appeared 3 nights in 1 week," he explained. "Engine warm in below freezing temperature. Idling without headlights. Same driver silhouette. Same time window between 11:58 p.m. and 12:12 a.m. "How did you know something was wrong?" the prosecutor asked. "Because repetition without variation suggests purpose," Daniel replied calmly. The courtroom listened. And why did you decide not to drop Miss Ellis at her home that night? Daniel's voice did not waver. Because if I did, she would have walked into a dark house with a man already inside. The defense tried to imply paranoia, suggest that Daniel had exaggerated ordinary street activity. But then the prosecution played the patrol body camera footage showing Hallberg handcuffed behind Margaret's townhouse. They displayed the photographs from his garage. They projected the contingency list. The jury did not look confused. They looked convinced. Closing arguments were brief. The verdict came faster than anyone expected. Guilty on all counts.
White fraud.
Financial manipulation. Obstruction of justice. Attempted witness intimidation. Unlawful entry with intent. When the sentence was announced months later, it was substantial enough that Richard Hallberg would spend the remainder of his working life in federal custody. Margaret expected relief to wash over her. Instead, she felt something quieter. Closure did not erase what could have happened. It simply confirmed that it had not. In the weeks that followed, life began reshaping itself. The insurance firm implemented sweeping reforms. Multi-layered authorization systems. External compliance oversight. Biometric archive access. Independent settlement audits. Margaret was offered a supervisory position in the compliance department. She declined. "I'm good where I am," she said simply. She did not want elevation. She wanted steadiness. Daniel continued driving nights, but something subtle had changed between them. Margaret no longer sat in the back seat. She preferred the front now, conversation easier that way. They talked more openly. About fear. About attention. About the thin line between routine and vulnerability. One evening, Daniel's phone rang while they were stopped at a red light near the river. He glanced at the screen and hesitated. "My son," he said quietly. He answered. Margaret pretended not to listen, but she could hear the shift in Daniel's voice, careful at first, then softer. His son had seen the news coverage, had read about the driver who documented patterns, who refused to ignore warning signs, who likely prevented a violent confrontation. "You did the right thing," his son said. Margaret saw Daniel's grip tighten slightly on the wheel. After the call ended, he pulled over. He did not try to hide the emotion this time. "I almost lost him years ago because I stayed quiet," Daniel said, voice breaking. "This time I didn't." Margaret reached across the console and squeezed his hand. "Sometimes redemption doesn't come from fixing the past," she said gently. "It comes from choosing differently next time." Slowly, Sundays became something new. At first, coffee at a diner. Then dinner at Margaret's townhouse, now reinforced with new locks, motion lights, and small security cameras tucked beneath the eaves. Daniel introduced her to his mother, whose memory faded in unpredictable waves, but whose smile remained constant. Weeks later, his son joined them, awkward at first, cautious, but willing. Three people who had nearly lost something essential sat around a modest kitchen table and rebuilt it deliberately. Margaret also began mentoring a younger compliance clerk at work, a woman working late shifts to support her family. One night, Margaret handed her a cup of tea without explanation. The young woman looked startled. "Thank you," she said softly. Margaret understood exactly what it meant to be seen when most people looked past you. Time moved forward. The townhouse felt livable again, not because it was invulnerable, but because she no longer mistook quiet for safety. She understood now that danger rarely announces itself loudly. It hides inside routine, inside schedules, inside the comfort of assuming tomorrow will look exactly like today. Kindness had not saved her because it was sentimental. It saved her because it built connection. Connection created awareness. Awareness created action. And action altered the outcome. Margaret turned 64 the following spring. She still worked nights. She still carried tea in a thermos when the wind cut sharply off the lake. But she no longer felt invisible. And she no longer believed that paying attention was paranoia. It was responsibility. If Daniel had taken the usual turn that night, she would have stepped into darkness without warning. If she had dismissed the small inconsistencies in her audit, the fraud would have continued quietly for years. If either of them had decided to mind their own business, the ending would have been different. The lesson was not dramatic. It was simple. Notice patterns. Trust unease. Offer kindness. Listen carefully. Because sometimes the smallest deviation, a missed turn, a second cup of tea, a moment of attention, is the exact point where a life quietly changes direction. And sometimes, survival begins not with courage, but with someone choosing to look twice.